All right, part three. We're going to talk about your leave in Australia when you were in the military and hitchhiking through that whole area. I know you've shared with me that you kind of only applied yourself in school the things you were interested in, but one of those things was definitely geography, and you kind of had already had a good idea of what Australia was like and the different cities, and kind of maybe had a good picture in your head as to what you were going to experience. So is that why you chose Australia? Because I think you had a choice to kind of go anywhere if you had extended your leave, right?
Yes, well, like I mentioned earlier, this fellow that was in Vietnam told me about, the MG and this other thing. And he says, you could go anywhere in the free world you want to go. They'll pay for your ticket, and they will also get you a passport. And when I was younger, I was on the farm 10 miles from nowhere. I all of a sudden we got this paper called The Farmer. There was a game in it. It was called Island Game. And all they're trying to do is sell you a book, an atlas. But I would play that all the time and send it back in, and you'd pick an island here, there, wherever. So I kind of got a picture as a young boy in my little idle time on the farm, picking these islands. So I got to know where things were, which way you had to go to get there, and what was in between. And so I was interested at a very, very early age. And then I mentioned before, I did a term paper on Australia. I didn't do very well because I didn't get the footnotes or had my head in the wrong place, which I usually did. But I remembered everything. I knew where it was. I knew how big it was. I knew how vast it was. So I had it in my mind after this fella told me about it. I think I'm going to do that. And I actually went to Vietnam figuring I would do that depending on where I went. I was fortunate to get to Chu Lai because that's where I learned my trade. It was very busy and you had to be on your toes. I could have gone up north and gotten blown out of a tower like a couple friends of mine did, but I didn't. So I went in and I talked to the people there and I said, I'm going to extend. I want to go to Australia. Well, they said, what? Shortly after I did that, about a month or two, my best friend got killed. And it was like, okay, you're still here. What do you think about it now, Callahan? I said, I'm still going. So I got everything in order. I was saving money, and they sent me to Okinawa from Da Nang again. And from there, I had to get a passport and get ready to go. It was good. I mean, we just had a little grass shack, and everybody kind of missed the place to go potty on the way out. And it was kind of a bad place. But I got to a couple Air Force clubs, and I thought I'd died and gone to heaven because you could actually get some things that you couldn't get where I was. So I spent time at the Air Force Club at Da Nang, and I also spent time in Okinawa. I had everything was ready to go. I got my passport, and I left from Naha, Okinawa, the major international airport. I picked Perth, Australia purposely because it was out of the way, and I wanted to start on the West Coast and go to the East Coast. But my route of flight, because there were no direct flights, I ended up going from Okinawa to Taipei to Hong Kong to Bangkok and then to Singapore. And the last leg was from Singapore to Perth on Air India. And some of them flight attendants were drop dead beautiful. So I got into Perth, and by then it was September. It was coming into their spring, but I had developed a cold. So I thought maybe I better take some fruit. So I got myself a pint of brandy and some fruit. And I went up to the hotel room for a day or two and recovered, or thought I did. But I stayed in Perth in a real old hotel called the Australia. Perth was about 100,000 back then. Now it's over 1 million. And it was a quaint little town. And we would come down for breakfast. They wanted everybody to come down to the main room. There's about a dozen or 15 of us. The bathroom was down the hall as it was in the beginning. And then I would talk to people, but it was so interesting because there were people from Asia that were there that were prospecting. There were a couple other Europeans that were there, and very few Australians staying at the hotel, but some of these were prospectors, some were just adventurers. Uh, I thought I could take the railroad to Kalgoorlie, and that was the narrow gauge track. And then I could just hop on the Trans-Australia Railroad. That was my initial plan. So I did that. I had second class sit up, but the clerk wouldn't even let me lay down because there's a name for guys like that, but he wouldn't let me even lean over. He says, "You paid for sit up and you will sit up." Okay, sir. I got to Kalgoorlie in the morning. It was a 12-hour ride. And I thought, well, hell, I'll just go into the railroad station and hop on the other one. And the guy looked at me like I was crazy. He says, "You know, mate, that railroad goes 3 days here and back." And he says, "You don't have a reservation. They're booked up for a month." He says, "You won't be able to get on anyway. Otherwise, you'd have to wait here a couple days." So what am I going to do? I hitchhiked back 300 miles across the desert, not knowing there were some bad snakes and stuff out there that could kill you with one bite. But I was fearless. And I ran into this fellow that was a Swiss national that was an Australian now. And he had spent some time as an exchange student in America. So he was really interested in my story and what I was doing there. He took me to his house, and his wife was interested, and he would translate some of the stories I relayed to her. They had a little boy, and it was just like old home week. But like everything else, I lost contact with him. But he said to me, he says, "Here's what you want to do. You want to hop on a bus, and if you want to hitchhike, I wouldn't advise hitchhiking across from Perth westbound." He says, "You can take the bus maybe as far as Adelaide." And he says, "It's more populated there, then you can hitchhike back and around." So I did that. They had two bus lines, much like the US. They had Red Line and Pioneer. So I hopped on the bus going out of Perth. On the bus, there was an Australian football team. They call themselves the Footballers. They were a fun group. Later on, I kind of learned there was a cross between soccer and rugby or something like that. There's a different rules anyway. And they called me Minnesota. So we had a good time. We'd stop at the pubs on the way, few and far between. I got to Adelaide and stayed there for a little bit. Then I started hitchhiking. What I would do, I'd talk to a cabbie and say, "How far to the main road will it cost to get me here?" They knew what I was up to, so they'd get me out on the main road, and I thumbed out. So I went all the way down the road to Melbourne, hitchhiking. People were picking me up. Everything was good. Guys would stop on the road and say, "This mate's an American," and he says, "I know so-and-so will be by here next," and I'll just tell him. So it was wonderful. It was just wonderful how they treated us. Of course, I was stopping at the pubs, this and that, and talking to whoever I could find. But I ended up in Melbourne late at night, and I was having a hamburger on some street thing out there, and I ran into two guys. Well, they were down for the weekend, and they were going back to Murray Bridge, which was back the other way. And they wanted me to come along. And it was like all night drive. And of course, they had beer in the car. And then I went to the bar where they were from. And I don't know, I think I got propped up on the road late at night, and off I went. And I went back through Melbourne. But in Melbourne, I ran into a fellow that was a serviceman, and he basically took me most of the way to Sydney. I spent a couple days in Sydney, and then I turned around and did the same thing. I hitchhiked back to Melbourne and all that. And I got some ideas, I saw how these trees were planted along the road, a town named Geelong for the veterans. So I had that in the back of my mind when I purchased some land and lined the driveway, but they were ash trees, so pretty soon they'll have to go as well, but somebody else owns it now. So I picked up a lot of things and talked to a lot of good people, but this is what the Australians told me. They didn't really like the British. As most of you know, Australia was a penal colony. And a lot of my early ancestors from Ireland were banished there. Those that didn't die along the road with the famine were sent to Australia as prisoners, penal colony for what we would call today minor misdemeanors. And they were actually pretty strong in the country, but there's a great hatred for the British. They call them the bloody pummies. And they also told me, they said, mate, you should have worn your uniform. Because if we would have known you were a Marine, you probably would have gotten a free pass across the country and you might even gotten on the railroad. They said, you guys saved us. He said, you guys saved us, because he says, you guys fighting in the Pacific kept them from getting into Australia. He says, we'd have been Japanese, because he says they were bombing Darwin, but he says it's because of all the things you did and the one army division that was up there with them, I believe it was the 25th. It was something else. And they said, you should have worn your uniform. Well, you know, I had already been in country and I just didn't want to wear it. I just wanted to travel as me. The other interesting thing, when I would talk to people, they never thought that I was American. First, they thought I was on the run, that I was escaping or AWOL or something. But then they says, you don't really sound American. We think you're either Irish or Canadian. I says, you're right on both. I says, pretty close to Canada, from Minnesota. Oh, you're from Minnesota. I said, yep, yep. So it was a great trip. It was a fun trip. Now, on the way back, I stopped in one of the larger cities and I stopped to Malaysia Singapore Airlines. This is when you could jury rig your flights and change it and do all this stuff without a problem, without a fare. So I talked to this nice looking young lady. I said, could I spend 2 days here, 3 days here, 1 day here? Because I had up to 45 days to get back. She says, certainly. So I ended up spending a couple days in Bangkok, extra day in Singapore, and Hong Kong, just a quick stop. And then through Taipei, another quick stop in Okinawa. I ended up darn near missing my flight coming out of Hong Kong, because I went uptown. I had too much beer. And they knew, they said, are you so-and-so? Because they're calling my name. I said, yes, I am. And they rushed me to the plane, but the plane had already kind of pushed back
Oh, God.
from the gangway. They had the back door down on the 727. So they rushed me to the door and I ran up the stairs. And about the time I got into the aircraft, the door shut and they took off. And I don't remember much of that flight because I was kind of, well, tired, sick, drunk, whatever you want to say. And I ended up going to Taipei and then back through Okinawa. By the time I got back to Vietnam, I went to a place called Marble Mountain, which is a helicopter base just outside of Da Nang. And the Marines had it, of course, and all their choppers are there. And some of the guys knew me and they knew I had been in country for a while. So, but by that time, I had a bad case of the diarrhea, or like I've said lately, loose stool syndrome. And it was because I was eating native, drinking beer and all this stuff. So I had a roll in my BDU pocket, just in case. And these guys are trying to get me to laugh and everything else. So by the time I got there, I barely had enough for cab fare in Okinawa. And 2 days later, I'm back in Vietnam and doing my thing. But what I didn't know was, yeah, you extended for 6 months, but you actually extended for 7 because the month you were gone was tacked on the end. So yeah, I did my thing. I had a good time, and it was an adventure. It really was. And I learned a lot about people, learned a lot about travel. learned a lot about the country. I even went to the control tower at Perth and talked about maybe getting a job there. And they said, well, mate, if you want to be a controller, you better be a controller in America, because the government takes so much of our salary here and you just wouldn't do as well. Trust me on that. So I did. The other thing I did, I went to a Catholic church in Perth and I looked in the phone book just for kicks. There was a whole page of Callahans in that book. And I know most of them were probably prisoners at one time or other. So it was an amazing trip. It was a learning trip. And it was a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
Awesome. I don't have anything else to ask you. We covered a lot of it. Anything else you can think of before we wrap up?
No, all I want to say is to my brothers and veterans and sister veterans, semper fi, my friends, and good luck. Keep the faith.